I've said it before, and I'll say it again, that I think the more that we can live like prehistoric hunter-gatherers, the more that we can keep our animal side happy, the better off we'll be, both mentally and physically. And I believe that the story of Adam and Eve is actually the story of human society before the agricultural revolution. So I think that the Garden of Eden was a symbol for how we used to live before we started farming. In the story, Adam and Eve are naked. They are living off of the bounty of the land, you know, like hunter-gatherers. They are living very much in harmony with nature. Once again, before the agricultural revolution, there was no need to tame nature. We took it as it was, and we shared its bounty with our plants and animal brethren. And I believe that the happiness that everyone attributes to Adam and Eve, that this was paradise, is, I think that we as a species were probably far happier in those days without all the modern conveniences than we are now, living in alleged comfort and opulence. I think that everything that we dealt with back then was something we could understand, except maybe, you know, things like the sun rising and who made the world and all those kind of questions that religion answered. But as far as our day-to-day activities, everything we touched, everything we did had a purpose, and it was well understood. We lived in small communities where we knew basically everybody, and really, not that scholars are infallible, but if we believe the scholars, we lived in relative ease because, you know, we're harvesting, we're gathering from the earth. We're not farming, we're not storing very much, we're not preparing, we're not building. None of that. Didn't have to worry about it. Just living off the land, small communities, and I think that the picture that the Bible paints of the Garden of Eden being paradise is how life was as a hunter-gatherer. And I think it was better. Depends what you mean by better. Like, we didn't have video games. You know, so what? You don't miss what you didn't know you didn't have. So I think that we were much happier and healthier living like that. Now, with the fall of Adam and Eve, some interesting things happened. This is when they get the command to, I forget the words exactly, but to increase and multiply and take over the earth. Which, living as a hunter-gatherer, you're very much living with nature. Now, moving on into the agricultural revolution, that is true. We did have to start fighting nature in a certain sense. You know, you've got to plant, you've got to plow, you've got to build, you've got to cut down trees, you've got to pick rocks. And now we're talking once again another quote, you know, the sweat of the brow. Whereas before we lived in relative ease with the agricultural revolution, we have to work. This is when work becomes a thing. So it makes sense that the punishment for us leaving that way of life and moving into the agricultural way of life was work. That's our punishment. And also, the tree of knowledge of good and evil can kind of play into this, because now we're harvesting nature. We're manipulating nature. We're, dare one say, abusing nature a little bit more. Also, along with farming, there comes property. Which means conflict. Probably a lot more wars between tribes. Now that land and good farmland is considered valuable. So, the knowledge of good and evil, you know, we were probably relatively innocent as hunter-gatherers compared to when we became farmers, because property, manipulating nature, probably a lot more keeping of animals and harvesting the kept animals as opposed to just hunting. And you know, I'm sure all of a sudden morals and laws, we had to start worrying about things like that we didn't necessarily have to worry about before. So that whole knowledge of good and evil, we became a lot less innocent, which is exactly what happened to Adam and Eve with the eating of the apples. They lost their innocence, right? That's the story. So yeah, I think that the story of Adam and Eve is an allegory of prehistoric humans switching from hunter-gatherers to the agricultural revolution, and every ensuing revolution since then has just made it so much worse. I mean, comfort, yes. Wealth, yes. Happiness, hell no. We are more unhappy now than probably a peasant in the middle of the Black Plague in the Middle Ages. So, yep, we're definitely not doing ourselves any favors. And, you know, AI's around the corner, so I'm sure that'll fix everything. And, yeah, it's just a very interesting, I guess, thing that supposed progress does to us. You know, every new technological advancement, every new convenience, every new social media network that you have to join, every new, you know, development, they just all seem to make our lives more complicated, more confusing, more out of touch with reality, more out of touch with nature, and, you know, more hateful towards each other, and less happy with ourselves and everything around us that is our current environment in the modern world. everything, all these new things they just add to the noise rather than bring peace. And I kind of look at Adam and Eve and those stories and the transition from the relatively, I'm sure it was hard, but relatively peaceful and serene life of the hunter-gatherer to the laborious life of the early farmer. And I just picture these early peasants out there working away in their fields, sweating and getting sunburnt and toiling, probably for somebody who was higher up in the social hierarchy than they were, and just thinking about Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and how that old original life that we left behind so many thousands of years ago, how that really was paradise. And kind of a sad thought, but it is what it is. There's no going back.